Well, hey there. Happy Thursday. Kyle Curtis here, NonSequitur, joined always by Steve McRae. Hello, Steve. Steve,
Hello.
I believe Steve has a message that he wanted to get out real quick, right, Steve? About
Oh, I just
Holy
wanted
Kool-Aid.
to give thanks. I just wanted to give thanks to Thomas, aka Holy Kool-Aid, on his video that he did, where he had a number of skeptics and YouTubers do a collaboration on flat Earth questions. I believe it was 20 questions he had asked, and he was nice enough to invite Kyle and myself from the Non Sequitur Show to be a part of that, and we had asked our particular question that we wanted the flat Earthers to answer. Which, by the way, not holding breath that they will. But I did want to put out a shout to him that we did appreciate that, and we were honored to be part of that collab. And that if you guys have not seen that video yet, go check it out on Holy Cooley's channel, and I will put the link in the video description.
But not right now. Wait till the show's over.
But not right now.
And David,
Watch this
as
first.
always, back for producing, and we have one of our favorite guests, I think, back with us today. And I know that a lot of you out there have been asking when she's gonna be back on, and here she is, the so intelligent Dr. Maggie Bryson. Thank you for joining us again and coming back.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I really enjoyed talking to you guys last time, and with a flattering introduction like that, I'll be back every Thursday. So
we're always nervous about it when we have guests come back, because that's a sign, I think, when you are able to survive, I think, because that's what coming on this show sometimes feels like, surviving, isn't it, Steve?
It's a trial by fire. Yeah.
But nonetheless, we thank you very much for coming back on, and we're going to have a discussion tonight on the Pharaohs of Egypt and some fascinating things about them, and maybe some stuff that you guys haven't heard. But before we do that, as always, I'm going to flip through real quick on the screen what we've got coming up. Tomorrow, it was requested that we do a debate on whether or not it is okay to spank your children. So we have 3 people going to be entering in that debate tomorrow. That's tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And then if Flat Earth is your thing, then this weekend is all for you. We have on Saturday the most requested guest that we've had so far coming. Finally, for you guys, he will be here at 8 o'clock on Saturday. That is Greater Sapien. And then on Sunday, the 2 gentlemen from across the pond, they're on your right. They call themselves Beyond the Imaginary Curve, and they recently did a breakdown of a debate we did 2 weeks ago. And they have questions they want to go through. So we said, sure. So on Sunday, we will actually be joined by Red's Rhetoric and Beyond the Imaginary Curve. And then on Monday, I don't know if you guys noticed, but yesterday we tried the Jehovah's Witness debate. And due to issues on his side, some tech issues, we had to reschedule that. Those are fixed. We got with him earlier today, and everything so far is smooth. So we will be doing that on Monday now, same time at 5 o'clock Eastern. So that's with Telltale Atheist and Lloyd Evans. I always get him and John Cedars. They're the same people, but I always confuse them. And that's what we've got coming up. That's it for now. And we'll flip back over here. And now we will turn it over to Dr. Bryson to introduce herself, if this is your first time with us and seeing her. That way you can know where she's coming from, know what she's done, and then we will start breaking down some old kings of Egypt. Dr. Bryson?
Thanks, guys. I'm Maggie Bryson. I am a recent Ph.D. graduate from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where I'm reporting in from. I did my doctorate in ancient Egyptian art history with a focus on the reign of the pharaoh Horemheb. And the title of my dissertation was The Reign of Horemheb, History, Historiography, and the Dawn of the Ramesside Era. So my research interests are pretty broad, but Egyptian kingship, the issue of what it meant to be king of Egypt, how you got that power, how you held it, how you expressed it, is one of my favorite things to think and talk about. And it's been a core focus of a lot of my research in the past. So I'm excited to talk with you guys about it tonight.
Excellent. Well, let's dig right in then. Tell us what number one, what you mean by what it means to be a king and the kingship of Egypt, and kind of introduce. I guess we're going to break down. I've got six pharaohs that, generally speaking, are the most recognizable, so that everybody can kind of follow along. But introduce that framework of what it meant to be a pharaoh, how they became a pharaoh, and how that kind of got started.
So at the moment where we see Egypt sort of emerge from the darkness of prehistory, right? So the moment where we begin to really have artifacts, writings that we can identify as classically pharaonic Egyptian, at that same moment, we start to see the symbols of kingship, of being a pharaoh, come up in Egyptian art and in the objects that we find in high status tombs. So pharaohs, right, this particular model of being a king, being the king of Egypt, is as old as the Egyptian state itself, and it's one of the sort of first great government institutions of the world, really. And one of the longest standing problems in human history is, what does it mean to be in charge? What does it mean to have power? What does it mean to have authority? Why are some people in charge of whole countries? Why do some people rule the world while the rest of us don't? And why do we really need these big men in charge anyway? In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was central to almost every aspect of life. He was a god, he was a man, he was a warrior, he was a ruler. And so you can just sort of explore these different facets of what it meant to be the king of Egypt just endlessly. It's really amazing. But again, so I'm interested in the question of how kings got and held power. And there was a traditional model of what it meant to be king of Egypt. The idea was that you became king of Egypt because your father was king of Egypt. He was a ruler who had sort of been given the right to rule by the gods. And you then, as his son, inherited both his sort of his life force, his Ka, and the life force of all of your royal ancestors. And a son would follow his father, and his son, his father, in order for all eternity since the beginning of time. There had to be a king of Egypt in order for the world to function correctly, in order for mankind to have an interaction with the gods, in order for the sun to come up every morning and go down every night. And so kingship was so central conceptually to ancient Egyptian life that we can sort of easily lose track of the fact that in reality, there were a lot of complications to that model. Sometimes a king didn't have a son to follow him. Sometimes a man wanted to be king who didn't have a royal father. Sometimes a brother would follow his brother as king of Egypt. There were kings of Egypt who probably weren't all that great at being kings. So it's easy to lose sight of all the conflict, all the upheaval that comes with politics in any place and any time when we study the kings of Egypt, because they were so good at portraying themselves as gods, as the masters of the universe. But we know that that stuff was going on. And there are moments in Egyptian history when you can see it, and there are moments when it's harder to see. But what I figure we could probably talk about tonight is some of the classic elements of Egyptian kingship and some of the occasions, right, where those classic things sort of broke down, and we get to see the way the sausage is made, so to speak.
How many pharaohs were there total?
It's hard to say because there are periods where we don't have accurate king lists. The history of Egypt is traditionally broken up into 30 dynasties. So from about 3000 BC to about 30 BC, with Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, being the last pharaoh of Egypt.
They went out with a bang.
They did. Yeah, they saved the best for last.
But
I'm
we would still have pharaohs today if that lineage continued, right? If they had offspring and that by divine providential, whatever it is, whoever was related to them, wouldn't they still be pharaohs in their eyes?
Well, Cleopatra had children. And when Julius Caesar, right, was in Egypt, you know, they got together. They had a son named Caesarion, right? And when Augustus conquered Egypt, he became pharaoh. There are representations of Augustus Caesar as a king of Egypt wearing Egyptian dress with his name in a cartouche. So the institution of pharaohdom didn't stop with Cleopatra.
Wow.
When the Romans took over, we tend to think of that as the last, gasp of the Cleopatra's reign is the last gasp of the very traditional Egyptian pharaohhood, if you will. I mean, the Ptolemaic dynasty isn't one of the traditional 30, but to me, right, 30 BC, the Battle of Actium is kind of that last great moment of Egyptian kingship.
David, since we're kind of on Cleopatra, go ahead and put Cleopatra up so that people can. I think it's the last one, I believe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how did the people?
The only one I would have recognized.
Oh, and let me tell you guys, before we came on, we were cycling through the pictures to make sure that we had them all, and she was naming them off like nothing. I mean, she was just boom, 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 boom. So she knows her stuff, that's for sure. But how did the people of Egypt respond to having Romans kind of coming in and taking the place of their pharaoh? I mean, that to me wouldn't sit very well.
Well, it didn't always. But by the time the Romans conquered Egypt, you have to remember Cleopatra was the scion, right, the descendant of a Macedonian family. She was essentially Greek. And before her, Egypt had been ruled by Assyrians, it had been ruled by Persians, it had been ruled by Libyans, it had been ruled by Nubians, it had been ruled by the Hyksos, so an Asiatic dynasty, a dynasty that came from modern-day Syria-Palestine, really sort of Israel, the Palestinian coast. So they had a lot of experience dealing with foreigners being in charge. And the Egyptians had a lot of different ways of relating to these foreign rulers. Some of them, the wealthy elite who managed to get in good with the foreign rulers, if that makes sense, a lot of times were very positive toward them. And the only successful foreign rulers of Egypt were the ones who adopted the outer trappings of pharaonic kingship. They were the ones who dressed like pharaohs. They were the ones who wore the right crowns, who had the right inscriptions, who took Egyptian names. Right? So when this image of Cleopatra, right, she has a cobra at her forehead, a very critical symbol of Egyptian kingship. She's wearing an Egyptian-style tripartite echeloned wigs, right, with these two sort of masses of hair hanging down over her shoulders and one in the back. She would have had a crown on. I can't see. I suppose that would have been a modius. She's wearing an Egyptian gown. So she's presenting herself here as an Egyptian ruler, an Egyptian queen, actually, in this case. Mm-hmm. So the Egyptians worked well with foreign rulers in a lot of situations, but there are other situations where they would either outright rebel or simply just persist in kind of living the way they had always lived and ignore their foreign overlords. So it depends a lot on the place and time.
So tell us how, I'm thinking if I want to ask this now or kind of go in chronological order. I tell you what, Dave, let's take that down for right now. I want to kind of build up to, since she was the last kind of one, we'll build up to her. But tell me real quick, before we get into specifics, how the first pharaoh came about. Like, how was that decided and comes out of like nothing? Because literally you have up until that point. I mean, do you have records of what kind of went on, like who ruled or whatever in Egypt before there was an actual like deemed pharaoh?
Mm-hmm. We don't have clear records, but we have hints. So the foundational mythology of ancient Egyptian kingship is the unification of the two lands. Throughout Egyptian history for 5,000 years, if you count sort of all the way into the Roman period, right? For 4,000, what am I thinking? Throughout the entire span, all the millennia of Egyptian history, you have this myth of the unification of the two lands. There's an idea that Egypt consisted of two parts, the Delta in the north and Upper Egypt in the south. Upper Egypt, the Nile flows south to north, right? So Upper Egypt is the south, and the Delta, where the river empties out into the Mediterranean, is Lower Egypt. And there was always this perception that they were two distinct lands, and that the first king of Egypt was the man who managed to bring that entire geographic area, the entire Nile Valley and its delta exit into the Mediterranean, into a single country, a single unified kingdom, and rule it effectively. And it is sort of reported, most of our sort of narrative sources about this are very, very late, right? We have Manetho writing in the Ptolemaic period. So, a couple hundred years before Cleopatra, talking about Menes, the first king of Egypt, who pulled together the north and the south. And there are signs that there were major sort of cities, major settlements that had local sort of rulers in the period before Egyptian history came to be written by the Egyptians themselves. And that it was through some process of negotiation and conflict among those early rulers of major cities in Egypt, Abydos, Hierakonpolis, Nagada, that a unified state that encompassed the entire Nile Valley and Delta was formed. And whatever that process was, it stuck in their minds so much that it became the core of this mythology of kingship for millennia to come. And even today in Egypt, if you go there, there's still very distinct regional identities. People of the Delta think of themselves as distinct from the people of Upper Egypt.
Where did the God aspect come from, though? Where did this somehow that they were more than men? They were imbued by the gods to take these positions and lead.
That's a theoretical question. We can't ask them, what they were thinking at the time. And I wonder about that myself. There was a very strong element of sort of regional religion in ancient Egypt. Every city, every site had its own god. And the people who interacted with those gods on behalf of their communities were people of great importance, right? And the question of why religion is that important to people, right? Why they need to feel like there is one man who has the strength, who has the intelligence, who has the skill to interact with the gods is a difficult question to answer. But there must have been some element of that, because even in those very early days of kingship, the first title that the Egyptian king ever bore, right, before he was called Pharaoh, before he was called Lord of the Two Lands, he was called Horus. And Horus, as we know from later mythology, is the falcon god, right, who was the son of Osiris, and sort of the great symbol of Egyptian kingship for centuries and millennia to come again. So early kings of Egypt were called the Horus Jer, the Horus Den, the Horus Jet, right? The Horus Ka, before they had any other titles or any other names. So this idea that the god Horus has somehow stood in a special relationship with one man, that man was his earthly representative and embodiment, is a key element of this very early Egyptian kingship. And Horus was the local god of the city of Hierakonpolis in southern Egypt. So whether it reflects the fact that this powerful elite in the city of Hierakonpolis, which was one of the first major cemeteries where we see very high status graves with lots of burial goods, and kings being buried with wild animals, and in large tombs, decorated tombs, things like that. The idea that maybe you could think of it as a priesthood, right? A kind of a situation where somebody was powerful and was considered to be powerful through the patronage of the god Horus was able to claim a special stake in that consolidation of power from all these different centers around Egypt. Right, and there was another center, another big town in Egypt, right, called Nagada. And the god of Nagada is Seth. And early in Egyptian history, there were a series of kings who called themselves, you would have the Horus this, the Horus that, right? And then there's a period where you have kings called the Seth this and that, right? Indicating that their relationship with the god Seth was somehow important to their identity as leaders of the country, or leaders of, what of Egypt had been unified at that point. So
Pretty cool.
The first kings, does that make sense? Am I?
Yeah,
were they
absolutely.
minions of Seth, or were they like followers of Seth? When they took on the title of Seth, does that mean that they had also kind of a direct relationship with them? They also had some kind of special relationship with the gods, or they're just following of Seth of some kind?
Good question. You, I'm sure,
I
are
tried.
familiar with the idea of gods having hypostases, right? Earthly representatives, earthly embodiments.
Sure.
The idea that something material, like a human body, can carry within it in some way the essence of a divine being. There seems to have been an element of that in the Egyptian kingship from very early on. The kings of Egypt were the people whose relationship.
Right? I'm sorry. It would be an object, right? Not so much a person, but it'd be like an object, though, usually, or it can be a person as well. Because
It can be a person or an object.
And they would be the actual representation. They would have that dwell within them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The idea that there could be an indwelling of the essence of a god in a mortal ruler was a part of the concept of Egyptian kingship. It seems to have been even in the very beginning, right? The way the first kings of Egypt wrote their royal names was to put them in a sort of a rectangular box that had striations at the bottom, and it represented part of the facade of a palace, right? So the royal name would then be in a sort of empty spot in the top of this rectangle. And on top of that, there would be perched the image of a falcon, right? So you're sort of saying this man is in the palace, and here is the falcon god atop the palace, sort of combining those images of the place, the seat of royal rule, the person of the king, and the god who lent his authority and his essence to that man's rule, all sort of wrapped up into this one image.
That's fascinating.
It's called a seraph. You can Google it, actually, if you want to put an image of one of these up on the if you ever get to where you, I know we're busy, but if you get to the point where you want to put one up, it's called a seraph, Serekh. And it's really easy to find them.
Real quick. I'm sorry. Which is the god with the crane, the crane head, and the rest of him is like a regular man?
That's Thoth, and the bird is that's his sort of avatar is the ibis, and he is the god of writing, reading, record keeping. And he was considered sort of the vizier of the gods. He was the man who was in charge of administering the rulings, the decrees, the edicts of the sun god.
Cool.
The highest god.
I like how they've taken, I guess, animals that you would kind of think represent the different positions that they're taking. I mean, like the beetle. You've got the crane, the tiger. There's one guy that's green. I think it's Osiris, maybe.
Osiris is green. He has a man's face, and he has the body of a man wrapped up in mummy bandages. So he's all tightly bundled up.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating how they chose these different animals to represent these different aspects of their culture and their religion. Just because it's so like looking back, you can't picture just taking a beetle and popping it on somebody's head. But in the actual like scenery of the hieroglyphs, it's actually kind of cool. I mean, it all kind of looks really good together, I think.
But weren't the scarabs or the dung beetle reminiscent of death because they would see them, in these situations where they were around dead people and dung and feces and all that kind of stuff? So that somehow maybe in their mind they kind of interpreted this beetle to be more metaphysical in some ways.
The beetle was absolutely metaphysical to the ancient Egyptians, or had metaphysical connotations. For the Egyptians, death is almost never represented without the corresponding element of rebirth. Right? When the ancient Egyptians talked about death, it was almost always with an eye toward what came after. And the dung beetle represented the rebirth of life out of waste and destruction, is sort of what we usually hear, right? Because dung beetles lay their eggs in those balls. And so you have here this ball of poop, but out of it comes new life. And what's more, when dung beetles are making and maintaining their dung balls, they push them. They get sort of reared up on their back legs and they roll their dung balls along the ground. And to the ancient Egyptians, that was reminiscent of the way that the sun makes its progress across the sky.
That is fascinating.
That makes sense, right? They roll the sun across the sky.
Precisely. And what's more representative of death and rebirth and the eternal persistence of that cycle than the sun? It goes away every night and it comes back every morning.
Did they think that it was a new sun every morning? Did they literally think that it was a new object in the sky every morning? The sun was rebirthed and it was a completely new object. So they knew it was the same object being repeated, or
the Egyptians, the way that they represented it, right? The way that they represented it in mythology was to say that every night the sun went into the underworld and it transited across the underworld and faced enemies, but it always triumphed over those enemies and then was reborn in the morning and then proceeded across the daytime sky.
It actually was going underworld, if you think about it.
But this gets back to this flat Earth problem that I suppose
Yeah,
we want to avoid
yeah,
carefully tonight, right?
Yeah, they might have a problem with that model as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
There wasn't any flat Earth mentions in hieroglyphs. Just checking to make sure that the Egypt doesn't hold any secrets to the flat Earth, does it?
It does not. The Egyptians had no
Okay.
ideas about the shape of the Earth that are any more brilliant or wise than those of any other people.
I would say the Egyptians probably know more about the shape of the Earth than some people who watch um, this channel sometimes, just based on what
And you have
we've heard.
And you have to remember that there's a difference between what people know about the physical world around them and how they conceive of the metaphysical world.
Sure.
You know, we
Absolutely.
still say that the sun goes down at night, even though we know full well that the earth is going around it.
Right.
This is true. This is true. Yeah.
You'd be surprised, though, Dr. Bryson. You'd be surprised. So I have just like two more small questions, just because I'm curious before we go into the pharaohs. But when they're depicted, they're always depicted wearing the headdress and the. I'm assuming that's a beard,
Yes.
right? Now, what's the importance of that? Because that's that stands out and it's very elaborate. So what's the? Is there a story behind why they do that?
As for the beard, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know what the origin of that is, right? The braided beard, particularly if it was blue and made of lapis lazuli and gilded, we call it a divine beard. And it does represent divinity. But it's an attribute of divinity, at any rate. But what its origin is, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I'd have to look into
Gotcha.
it. The crowns each have a different connotation. We don't know what their physical form was in most cases. So if I couldn't tell you because if you look at the different images, right, you see different crowns if you look hard enough. And you start to recognize patterns in when those crowns are worn. There are people who have written books about what the different crowns symbolize and why a king would wear one in one scene or statue and another in a different one.
Well, I can tell you why they had the beard. Because it
Why is
looks
that?
freaking amazing.
It does.
Oh.
It looks really, really slick.
Seriously, I mean, so yeah, that's why. Clearly, aesthetics, man.
Makes
you look smart.
when I was
wise.
when I was researching
Boy, looks
this kind
All
of
you gotta do is
looks starting
braid
to
yours.
really like can be
you
confusing
should
there.
braid
Huh?
your Steve. You should braid it and dye it blue.
No,
Absolutely.
it's not. It's something I can actually
Wait,
braid.
wait. If we dye your hair gold, you already have the headdress. The way that
That's
it comes
true.
down to your shoulders like that. We'll braid your beard, dye it blue and gold, and you will be the pharaoh. Oh, that's brilliant.
I'm not putting a dung beetle on my head, but yeah, my hair is down past my shoulders.
Don't put an ibis on your head either. That could get messy.
No, I don't know what that is, but it sounds like it would be painful or messy. Either way, I wouldn't want it. What is it? An ibis?
An ibis, the bird that
Yeah.
Kyle was just talking about, the one that was
the one that. Oh, yeah, I don't want poop on my head. That would be bad.
Yeah.
What did I say? Was it a crane? Yeah, that was my fault.
Mhm.
Crane.
When I was
okay.
researching some of these things, it said that all the pharaohs wore and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly, a Nemes crown.
It's a folded cloth that they would wear on their heads.
What's the story behind that?
Again, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the origin of that is, except to say that wearing a cloth covering on your head makes very good sense in the desert in Egypt, right? And that particular fold of the cloth and the striped fabric are associated with regality. And it was very much a royal symbol. But the Nemes headdress is one that seems to be worn, the headcloth is one that seems to be worn in situations either where the king is being shown. There are a lot of different possible symbolic connotations. And if I had looked into this a little, if I had known we would be talking about it, I would have looked into it a little bit for you.
Oh, this was last minute. This was totally last minute on my part.
But I tend to think of it as one that's the standard, the classic go-to headdress of the Egyptian king. And it can be used in a lot of different situations. It can take a lot of different forms and functions, and it can be combined with other crowns.
Awesome. Okay, now let's go into what many people would regard as probably although I looked at these pharaohs online, I tried to get kind of a pretty standard list of them across several, different places online. And I looked at 6 places, and we were just talking about this before we came on, but only one of those 6 mentioned Ramses II, and that's kind of baffling to me, I think, because wouldn't he be considered like the greatest pharaoh of Egypt?
He's one of the longest reigning monarchs in the history of the world, and he probably left his name in more places than any other king of Egypt.
Yeah, that's shocking. That was shocking to me. So I think we're going to add him anyway, and maybe we won't get to all 6 of these, but let's start with somebody that I think, to me anyway, I asked this question again prior to the show coming on. You have all of these statues across ancient Egypt depicting pharaohs, and all of these statues have the pharaohs as, their physique is almost perfect. They're buff. There's no kind of abnormalities, anything like that. And there was one pharaoh who chose not to go that route. He wanted himself depicted exactly as he was, and his name was Akhenaten.
Yes, Amenhotep IV, or early in his career, and then Akhenaten after he revolutionized Egyptian religion.
Okay, so by the way, I'm going to butcher these names. I'm going to go ahead and it's hard for me sometimes to get English words correctly. So me trying to
I have the
get
same
through
problem.
this is going to be pretty
I'll
funny.
tell you what, he'll say the name, and I'll try to pronounce it. We'll both butcher it. That we were in the same boat here, and then you tell us how it's pronounced, because everybody knows I am the worst at pronouncing certain things. So I don't want Kyle just to be the only one to butcher this stuff. So you tell me what it is, and I'll try to pronounce it as well.
I'm not a native speaker of ancient Egyptian either.
Well,
so
I don't think anybody
my
is
pronunciations
nowadays,
are anglicized too, right? So my pronunciations are
like
anglicized.
Yeah.
But I can tell you
us.
how Egyptologists say it, if nothing else.
Okay, that works. Just bail us out when you see us struggling. So I'm going to let you take it away and just kind of give us a overlook of who he was as a pharaoh. I know that he took the religion and kind of cut it down to just one deity. Correct?
Well, that picture's not him.
Yeah, David, I'm sorry. This is a different
Amenhotep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had 4.
I'm adding him in, David. That's my fault. We're going to start with the list right after we get done with him, but I just wanted to. I found that story about him interesting, so I want to add him in. So, Dr. Bryson, I'm going to let you take it away and tell his story.
Okay, so Amenhotep IV was the son of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, and think 1300 BC, 1350, sometime in that period, right? The second half of the second millennium BC. Amenhotep III ruled Egypt at a period where you might say it had kind of reached the peak of its wealth and power and glory. The reign of Amenhotep III was long, almost 40 years, and it was a period of peace and prosperity, and a period when Egypt was involved in international relations with all these sort of burgeoning powers of the late Bronze Age. So Amenhotep III he was often called the sort of dazzling sun of Egypt, right? He's sort of the Louis XIV of ancient Egypt in a lot of ways. He had a son, also named Amenhotep. And at some point, so when Amenhotep III died, his son Amenhotep IV came to the throne and began to rule Egypt in his father's idiom, in his father's stead. But at some point, the whole thing went off the rails. Amenhotep IV, around the 5th year of his reign, radically changed the religion of Egypt. He restricted the pantheon, essentially, to one god, a particular manifestation of the sun god. So for the ancient Egyptians, the sun was so important that it took dozens of forms. It could be the old setting sun at the end of the day. It could be the burgeoning new sun at dawn. It could be a lot of different things. It could be a god in human form. It could be a lot of things. But for Amenhotep IV, the best kind of sun was the disk, the big round golden sun at the top of the sky. And the name of that form of the sun was Aten, Aten. And Amenhotep IV decided that this particular manifestation of the sun was his personal, he had a very special relationship with this particular form of the sun, and that should be the only god that received the benefit of the adoration of the Egyptian king and his people, right? And there are a lot of different ways to talk about this in terms of the value you put on it. Was Amenhotep IV being cynical? Was he changing the religion of Egypt in order to enhance his own power? Was he a visionary, right? The first real monotheist, the first man who tried to bring the world into the light of monotheism? There are different ways to look at it and different ways that the story is told. And what we do know, though, is that a few years into his reign, the capital of Egypt was picked up and moved to a brand new city in Middle Egypt, halfway between Cairo and Luxor. And they basically built this new city from the ground up. We have stelae, right? We have documents carved into stones at various spots kind of around the boundary of, they call them boundary stelae, around the perimeter of this city that say, I, Amenhotep, right, or Akhenaten at that point, I came to this new site in order to sort of repeat creation, sort of create the world from the ground up, to honor the god Aten by completely starting over again, right, in this new place that belongs only to him. And so they built this city called Akhet Aten, which means the horizon of the god Aten, right? The sun goes to its horizon. That's kind of the home of the sun. And so they built this new city of Akhet Aten. He changed his name to Akhenaten, Akhenaten, and it means effective for the Aten, or the effective one, the man who is effective on behalf of the Aten, who does good things for this god. And they basically just sort of canceled all the parties at all the other temples around Egypt, if you will. The gods of Egypt had, in their temples, right, it was sort of like they had these massive landed estates. They had priesthoods; those were their overseers, their servants, their families, right? They had houses, right? These beautiful temples and these giant architectural achievements. They had lands, they had herds of cattle, they had household implements, basically. You know, you got up in the morning and you dressed the statue of the god and you put its makeup on and made sure that it had breakfast, right? So Akhenaten basically said, none of these other gods really deserve all that kind of attention the same way that the Aten does. And in fact, we're gonna pull the resources away from these other gods. And what's more, there's a particular god, Amun, right, the great god of the city of Thebes, the temple at Karnak, who is now to be anathematized. He was a bad guy. We don't want that god anywhere near us. He is no longer the god of kingship. And he sent his folks around the country to hack out the name and image of the god Amun.
Wow.
So
how was that received by the people? Because, you know, you have a group of people that are, I assume, very vested in their religion, and to be told that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, that's not the way it is anymore. I mean, there had to be some kind of like uproar about that.
there is a very eminent Egyptologist by the name of Jan Assmann. He's German. And he thinks of this episode, the reign of Akhenaten, as one of the great psychological, emotional traumas of the Egyptian people. Right? There's a thing called trauma theory, this idea that some event or episode can sear itself into people's consciousness, you know, such that it's remembered for generations, that people feel like its echoes and its sort of ripples of it, you know, affect generations of people to come. And Assmann has proposed that the Amarna episode, right, this moment when the traditional gods of Egypt were basically told to take a hike, was such a trauma for the Egyptian people. And there's certainly reason to think that Assmann is right. There's a famous poem that somebody kind of scribbled, or prayer that someone kind of scribbled on the inside of a tomb wall after the death of Akhenaten that says basically, you know, thank God you're back, Amun. We missed you.
I was thinking about this when I was learning about that earlier on in this week. But what do you think in his life growing up? Because obviously he had to have been raised in the kind of traditions of the faith before. But why all of a sudden the sort of attachment to the sun as a disc? And not having any kind of consideration for the fact that all of these other people are following all of these different gods. And I mean, there had to have been something that you can point to that would kind of justify that.
Well, first of all, it wasn't as sudden as it seems. When you look into it, and again, this is something that Asman is kind of the go-to authority on, and a lot of his books have been translated into English, if any of your listeners are curious about it. The idea is that the importance of the sun god had been growing for generations before him. So Amenhotep IV Akhenaten was the son of Amenhotep III. And Amenhotep III also referred to himself as a sort of manifestation, as an embodiment of the god Aten. And he was the dazzling Aten of Egypt. And even before him, so particularly like the reign of Thutmose IV is remembered or is known to have been a period when this was important. The cult of the sun god in general and its link to the kingship of Egypt was a point of focus, an increasing point of focus. So the idea that the king was a manifestation of the sun god was something that they had been big on and they'd been hyping for a long time when Akhenaten came to the throne. So for him to insist on this cult of the Aten, and he was one of his names, so the idea that he absolutely eliminated any other forms of the sun god, any other gods out of Egypt is a little bit complicated, right? His name, one of his names was Wa-en-Re, the only one, the sole one of the god Re, like the unique one of the god Re, and Re is another manifestation of the sun. So, and the god Herakti, Horus of the two horizons, right? A solar version of the god Horus, the embodiment of kingship, was also present in the mythology of Akhenaten. So it wasn't that the Aten as a personal thing, right, became the only god of Egypt conceptually. There was still this sort of recognition of the fact that the identity of the sun god was complicated and multifaceted. But what's really unique about...
Oh, no, go ahead.
What's really unique about Akhenaten is not that he thought, or that he seems to have thought that emphasizing his link to the sun god and the sun's centrality to his power as king and the sun's sort of validation of his rule. That's not the unique thing. The unique thing is that he picked up sticks and made a new capital and built a new set of temples and took resources away from all these other cults. And why he might have done that is a really obscure question. He might have been a sincere believer of the idea, right? That all of these different versions of the sun god, all of these different gods were elements, facets of a single divine essence, right?
I have a theory.
Or it gets
Go for
power
it.
hungry, right?
What if it's because he thought by eliminating those other gods, he could, and him being the only kind of thing in between, I guess, people and the new god, the sun god that he has now, it makes him more powerful, because there's no kind of competition with the other ones. It's just a direct line between him and this god. And here he has, on his part, eliminated all of the bad gods. So obviously he's going to be in favor that way. It just kind of makes it look like he's consolidated all of them into one, and he now has that unique connection to that god.
Mm-hmm. You've sort of summed up a lot of people's analyses of the reign of Akhenaten. It's
Cool.
The idea that he would have seen in this an opportunity to cut out the middlemen and eliminate the competition is not at all wide of the mark, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting to most of us, Egyptologists at least, or one thing that's really interesting about Akhenaten, I guess, is the fact that he was so strongly opposed to the cult of the god Amun, right, the great god of Thebes. The temple of Amun at Karnak was one of the single most important sort of economic and religious institutions in the ancient world. It was this enormous sprawling complex. It's still amazing. If you could spend weeks there just walking around and sort of looking at all the different chapels and chambers and scenes on the walls. It's one of the most amazing places I've ever been. It is probably.
The statues
I love it. Mhm.
They're like gigantic.
There are a lot of, yeah, well, there and half of the original decoration of the Temple of Amun at Karnak is now underground or it's been carried off. You know, what you see there is just a vestige of what once was. And it was basically a construction site for thousands of years. They were constantly modifying it, adding to it, moving things around. They would move around these giant things, you know, like obelisks and colossal statues. So the cult
How
of the
many
god
sphinx
Amun
are
was huge. Huh?
How many sphinx do
Oh,
they
gosh.
have?
How many sphinxes? I don't know, right? There's an avenue of sphinxes that connects the
Yeah.
Temple of Amun at Karnak with the Temple of Mut to its south, and then to the Temple of Luxor way down the road. There's a little dromos of ram-headed sphinxes as you come in from the riverside to the east-west axis of the temple, right? So there are dozens of them, and I should probably know the exact number, but I don't off the top of my head.
Oh, that wasn't meant like actually how many do you know, but in more like a rhetorical sense. Like there are so many when you looking down that kind of pathway, it's just sphinx after sphinx after sphinx after sphinx all the way down. I mean, it's crazy how they were able to do all of that stuff. And like you said, moving things like the obelisks and those granite, those pieces of granite are enormous.
Most of the architecture at Karnak is sandstone, but there are definitely elements in other stones.
Mm-hmm.
Granite.
What were some of the tools
diorite.
that they used? The actual tools that they used to do some carvings? Were they
Copper
obsidian?
chills and drizzles. Hard
So
stone
they had
pounders. And they had hard
no
stone
lasers?
tools, and they would use sand as an abrasive. Well, if they did, we haven't uncovered them yet.
Sorry, guys, no lasers.
They did not use lasers. No lasers,
Hey,
no diamond
lasers.
claws. Sand is a very effective abrasive, and there's a lot of it in Egypt. So a combination of physics.
Like round balls to kind of pound off the granite too, like almost like a bowling ball, and kind of shape it off that way.
Yeah, stone will fracture, right? If you hit it the right way. Even like a diamond, for instance, they're the hardest stone in the mineral world, but they fracture. If you hit a diamond the right way, it'll shatter. So if you know something about the physics of these different stones, you can use that combined with hard stone tools, metal tools, and abrasives to work them very effectively.
You generally just need something harder than the material that you're working with, right? For the most part.
And you don't always need something harder than the material you're working with. You need physics and abrasives.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. It helps to have things. Harder,
it helps very much to have harder things.
Let me ask about another interesting fact with him. His wife, Nefertiti.
Nefertiti. Yep.
She's depicted up until a certain point, and then there's no more mention of her. Is that correct?
There is an inscription that names her in year 16 of Akhenaten, and he ruled 17 years. The idea that she fell from favor or disappeared at some point in his reign is probably, I'd say it's not as tenable as we once thought it was, right?
Gotcha.
There
it's a good story.
Well, it is, and there are a lot of people who think that she took the throne in her own right after his death, either she or her oldest daughter.
Okay, cool.
So she may not have actually fallen out of favor or been killed, murdered and thrown in the Nile or whatever.
Yeah. The other thing about him the most fascinating thing I find about him is the statue thing. Do you have any theories of why he wished to be kind of depicted the way that he was and not in the form that you see most standard pharaohs?
So it's very clear that he had a particular, or at least his circle, right? The people who supported him and made him what he was, had a very clear idea of how he should look as king, and it was very different from anything that had come before. There's a text that was written for a sculptor who worked under him that basically said, the king himself told me how to make images. People had to be trained in this new way of making images of human beings. And it wasn't just the human figure that changed in his reign either. Those sort of range of things that you could represent changed. You get a lot of images of buildings and offerings piled up and things like that. And so you lose a lot of the traditional repertoire of images that were associated with the religion, the pre-Amarna religion of Egypt. And the sort of list of possible reasons why he chose that way of being represented is long. It runs the gamut from he himself was deformed in some way. He had a chromosomal abnormality. He had a hormonal imbalance. He had possibly Marfan syndrome is one diagnosis that's been proposed. Right, Marfan syndrome being that I think it's a connective tissue disorder that makes people sort of grow long and spindly and sort of slightly oddly
it also
shaped.
makes him very intelligent too. I have a friend that actually has that, and
Really?
he has a PhD at the age of 26. He got his PhD.
Oh my goodness.
Highly brilliant. And yeah, and it's funny because he's a PhD in philosophy, a minor. He has a bachelor's in applied mathematics and a master's in something else, and it's just like, yeah, really smart dude. So I that for some reason that connective tissue disorder, for some people just get really exceptionally bright off of it for some reason.
Maybe the genes are linked somehow, you know. The
I
same.
don't
What
know.
is it that sickle cell
But his
disorder is
fingers are
related
like,
to a resistance to malaria?
could be alien.
These great long fingers and really tall.
Yeah, really lanky. But smarter than hell.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Maybe he's
But-
just.
Yeah, he's
Well, and
working on
again, Akhenaten. You're kidding.
Yeah,
What's he studying?
Metaphysics is his concentration.
Tell him to ask him if he's read Jan Assmann. Assmann is actually pretty widely read outside of the field of Egyptology.
Sure.
You know, he's read by philosophers and historians.
Why would he do, like, I'm trying to get into the head of him, I guess. If he's wanting to, if it is a power thing and he's wanting to, you know, kind of instill something, you would think he would want to go with the more, I guess, physically imposing figure. But to instruct people that he wants to be, you know, I think it's commendable, but there's no like real strategic reason there. So it's got to be something, you know, more within him, if that makes sense.
Let's take two diverging hypothetical roads here. And help me remind myself that I want to go back to the point where we forked.
Sure.
So let's first start with the idea that he actually was physically abnormal in some way, right? Because that's not a given. We don't know that he was in any way physically abnormal, right? Let's start with the idea that he had Marfan syndrome. Why would he choose to have his own unusual physical configuration depicted? Well, first of all, the form of the sun god that he was representing, we know from hymns written to this god that he was a god of the natural world, right? He was the god who illuminated the world as it is. The entirety of the known universe sort of fell under the rays of this god and was nourished by him, right? The hymn to the Aten talks about the animals awakening in the morning, the birds chirping, and the grass being sort of dewy and green, right? If there is, and the art of the period is beautifully sensitive in its depiction of natural world. There are these images of birds and of people, and you know, it's gorgeous. And so, if there was some association between the Aten and the illumination of the natural world, right? The idea that he might want to be shown as he is in the bright light of day, I guess, is one sort of conceptual way you could go. I'm not sure that that is the right way to go, though. Because there are a lot of reasons to think that he wasn't necessarily deformed or unusually shaped. There is a tradition in ancient Egypt of that sort of big rounded belly and the full breast, that sort of shape, right? The long limbs, long fingers, right? Even these sort of feminine characteristics and the proportions of the body, right? Gay Robbins is an art historian who's kind of famous for talking about the feminization of the male body in terms of its proportions under Akhenaten. The idea that the ancient Egyptians had about creation was that it took a masculine and a feminine side to make that happen, right? You couldn't really have a world without male and female. That there were this sort of universe of dualities in Egyptian metaphysics, you know, light and dark, northern Egypt and southern Egypt, male and female, you know, and the duality of Egypt, right? There was the black land, the fertile, rich soil of the Nile Valley, and the red land, the desert beyond it. There's Egypt and the outside world. There, you know, so there are all these dualities, right? And male and female is one of the central ones in terms of the theology of ancient Egypt. And by showing himself the king, the most traditionally masculine and powerful figure in the Egyptian cosmos, as having feminine body characteristics, he's subsuming all of that creative power into himself, right? Does that make sense?
Maybe he was a genius. Absolutely.
Possibly.
Right? Or the
I mean,
people
that makes
who,
sense.
he had a great PR team.
Absolutely.
You know, whenever you think of the king of Egypt, you need to think of a court that surrounded him. You need to think of him as having had priests and courtiers and family members, his wives, you know, that surrounded him and supported him and played into the dynamics of his reign.
Yeah.
You know, so and this is another one of those big problems of history, right? How much of the dynamics of history do we attribute to the genius of individual people, usually men? And how much of it do we attribute to sort of dynamics, forces beyond the individual?
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
But yeah, he might have been just a really brilliant, sensitive, thoughtful person, right? Who had a great team of theologians and PR people working for him.
It's probably a combo of all of those. What about the fort? You said to take you back to the fort.
Okay. Well, that actually was the second half of the fork, right? The one side of the fork is, what if he is physically abnormal? Why might he have chosen to represent himself that way? The other one is, if he's not physically abnormal, why might he have chosen to represent himself that certain way?
That makes. I think the second part to me would sound more the way to go on that. But it could, like I said, it could have been a combination of all of those. So to wrap him up, when he died, did they instantly go back to the way that it was before him, or did they carry out his religious tradition of that one deity?
They after a few speed bumps in the road, so after a couple of years after his death, where there seems to have been some, again, this is a complicated question. Let me back it up here.
Okay.
The short answer is that they, very soon after he died, made him persona non grata throughout the length and breadth of Egypt. He was anathematized. He was hated. His image was hacked out. His statues were destroyed. The architectural changes that he made to temples in Egypt were undone. So he built this complex devoted to the Aten at Karnak, right, the temple of the god Amun, early in his reign. That was busted up, you know, turned into rubble, and that rubble was used to fill new construction at Karnak. And there are mentions of him in texts of the Ramessid period that call him the criminal, the rebel, right, the bad guy of Akhenaten. You know, he was hated in popular memory after his death.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the things that happened under him, right, including the great importance given to the cult of the god Horakti, right, this very strongly solar version of the god Horus, stuck around. The changes in the art that happened under him stuck around. There are a lot of characteristics of Amarna art, including the sort of shapes of human bodies, the proportions of human bodies, that linger for a generation after his death. The sort of Amarna, right, the post-Amarna period, the period when there was still stuff from the Amarna period around and the Egyptians were trying to figure out what to do with it, lasts until about the 20th year of the reign of Ramses II. So you have 20 years for Ramses into the reign of,
You would think that if they hated him that much, they would be in a like a quick hurry to alter the things that he kind of implemented. You know, if they're going around,
and in some ways they were. You know, in some ways they were. So Tutankhamun, for instance, right? His reign was a period in which they sent artists back into all these temples throughout Egypt to recarve the image of the god Amun, to sort of get rid of the name of Akhenaten, to get rid of the changes he had made, and to sort of replace those carvings. And you can really see in these images where the original stone had been hacked to get rid of the god Amun, and then where it's been sort of reworked and recarved to replace Amun in his original spot.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
But there were a lot of subtle things that lingered in spite of that.
I heard the word used when I was looking up these the Pharaohs, the one word that they all had for him was the heretic. They kept calling him the heretic. That was kind of what he was labeled, I guess. I don't know. It was just funny to me because I didn't see anything that he really did that was like evil. You know, like as far as being a cruel kind of dictator. But the reaction to him was like he was that, like he was just some horrific tyrant.
A really interesting point, right? Does someone have to be ill-intentioned for his actions to be perceived in a negative light?
No.
And is it likely in your mind that in any society, in any group of people where you've got more than 10 people, say, that any event, any action is going to be universally perceived the same way?
Absolutely not.
Right? Because when Akhenaten did what he did, he would have had to hire a lot of folks. You don't build a city from scratch without a lot of construction crews, right?
Good point.
He would have needed to train new artists, right? So people would have been employed not only in creating the art, but in training and managing the teams that were responsible for executing it, right?
Gotcha.
There's some hints that Akhenaten may have come to the throne, or at least at a period not long after he came to the throne, he may have actually faced some real serious political opposition in a realpolitik sense. The boundary stele that we were just talking about that sort of describe the founding of the city of Akhenaten mention terrible things that were heard in year 3, year 4, right? Like, as though there might have been some kind of murmurings of discontent at court. There might have been some threat to Akhenaten from within the upper echelons of Egyptian society. So there were probably factions involved in this, right?
Could that have been because of his monotheistic type view?
I almost always think of things in terms of who's going to benefit financially. I find that no matter how sincere people, I find that no matter how sincere people perceive their motivations to be when money gets involved, they tend to follow very predictable paths. Does that make sense? Like, your sincere beliefs and emotions often correspond very closely to your material interests and your experience of the world and of financial and material well-being. So I don't think there's any reason to rule out the idea that...
Sorry.
And it's funny just how persuasive that prosperity gospel nonsense is, right?
Oh, yeah. Well,
you
not
see
to me,
that,
but yeah. No, it really is.
Right.
Yeah.
The people who preach that prosperity gospel aren't necessarily cynics. You know, life has been good to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the best lie is the lie that you believe.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think that's exactly what they do. And yeah, they're not exactly, quote, directly lying per se. I mean, like you said, the prosperity gospel people, they have lived the good life. And I think that they are putting forth this narrative, hey, you believe like we believe, you can live this good life too. That's the lie.
Mm-hmm.
But
and this prosperity gospel, a lot of the prosperity gospel is couched in terms that are comforting and familiar to the people who follow it even to their own detriment, right? Prosperity gospel isn't a new religion. You know, these people, they have the Southern accents, they drive the Chevys, they have the cute little wives with their blonde hair that look like everyone's mom, right? So when you are looking at a man telling you, look, I lived this great life believing this, you could do it too, right? And you see all those symbols, all those images that evoke that response of comfort and familiarity in you. I mean, I don't necessarily blame people for following it, frankly.
I absolutely agree with you on that. Wholeheartedly.
That is so
I've
true.
seen it.
Well said, too. Well said.
Me too. I'm from Georgia.
Yeah.
Carolina.
This is why she's the smart one.
Yeah. Where are you from, Steve?
Well, but just recently, I read an article. I hate to get off topic, but
Liberal
I read an article. This guy was listening. He wanted $54 million for a new plane so he can preach the gospel all around the world. $54 million. And so when you're talking about money being a motivator, yeah, his motivation, I don't believe for a second, is to go preach the gospel around the world. It's to get a $54 million plane.
You left out the best part, Steve, though. He has 2 jets already.
He already has a couple jets, right?
stop for fuel. Like, he's tired of stopping to refuel. So he needs a $54 million jet to accomplish that.
But the word of God will not wait. The devil is lurking. He is at the door, and we need to be ready to meet him where he stands. Do you
Speaking
think
of good PR
this guy would be? I'm sorry. This is it's. Can you tell it's a pet soapbox of mine?
It is us.
But and again, this is why the study of the ancient world, to me, is something that's still worth engaging in, right? I mean, the people I study and think about every day have been dead for what? It's 2018 now, and my guy, Ramses II came to the throne around 1279 BC. They've been dead for over 3,000 years. So why do we study them, right? It's a data set. If you look at what people were doing all those thousands of years ago, all throughout the course of human history, I think it helps to put into perspective what's happening now.
I agree.
Oh,
and when it
comes
to this question
of all this stuff, sure, absolutely.
And when it comes to this
David
question of Akhenaten,
of Egypt, that Akhenaten was the Donald Trump of Egypt.
I don't know if I'd go there. There have been people who've tried to make him into either for good or for ill, the Adolf Hitler of ancient Egypt, right? Hitler himself was fascinated by Akhenaten. The Nazis were thrilled by the Amarna period. And there are people who've tried to represent him since then, right on the other side of that narrative, as a totalitarian dictator, a totalitarian ruler, right? In the model of a World War II era totalitarian strongman, right? Because what he did was he wrapped religion, economy, politics, all into one thing. And then he himself was right at the center of it. The whole l'état c'est moi, the state, I am the state. The classic absolutist line, could in some ways, legitimately be used to describe what it meant to be the king of Egypt, especially in periods like the New Kingdom.
That is fascinating.
If that makes sense. But
Absolutely.
When you think about Akhenaten's world,
I was just going to say the fact that Hitler kind of looked up to Akhenaten, I think, tells a lot. That's very telling, I think. There's such like a psychological element to all of this. Like, you must kind of, with all of the stuff that and being involved in this, you must like stay up late some nights trying to wrap your head around what some of these things can mean that are unexplainable. Because there's so many things dealing with Egyptology that just don't have answers to them.
Welcome to metaphysics.
And that would just drive me. That would drive me crazy.
It's the same thing.
It would drive me wild.
Well, we
People
have circumstantial
had existential
evidence.
crises on this stuff.
They absolutely have. And I think that a real serious scholarly study of it is a good remedy against that. I think if I didn't have the training that I do, and if I didn't have access to the books that I have access to, right, and if I couldn't read the texts for myself, I would lose a lot more sleep on it. But as it is, I at least have the ability to engage with this material and say, okay, well, here's what we can know. To the best of our ability to know anything, right? It becomes an epistemological problem after a while. And that, I don't think anybody ought to keep themselves awake at night with that sort of thing.
Yeah, don't say the E word. Don't say the E word.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see why people
get
do
started
that. I mean, there have
it
been
won't
nights
stop.
but there have been nights where people, and I've done it, you lay awake and you do think about, epistemological things, and you do think about your own epistemology and stuff. And it is very complicated. It's very deep. And I can see people literally, and I'm not even exaggerating, losing their minds trying to think about some of this stuff. And I'm sure they have.
Well, how often, like, have you noticed that I'll catch myself a lot when I'm speaking?
Mm-hmm.
When I'm talking about ancient Egypt, my mind is running 1,000,000 miles an hour. I'm trying to think of the different perspectives that other scholars, have brought to bear on these issues. And I try to think of the different facts that you might bring up in support or refutation of any given idea. And I doubt myself. I question myself constantly. And I think that's an essential part of the endeavor.
Would you say that doubt is a virtue?
Yes, absolutely. I think the absence of doubt is a symptom of stupidity.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will challenge you on that then. I will have a one-on-one
Shoot.
conversation with you on challenge you
Not,
on that with Richard Carrier. He's gonna come on, and he
not
wants to talk
here.
about this
Not
topic. But because I do not find in epistemology at all to be doubt of virtue, because and
well,
we'll have that another time. But
yeah,
you and
yeah.
I will have that discussion.
We had a
You're
discussion
on,
about this
Steve.
2 nights.
Awesome.
So he's yeah. We'll definitely set that up, but I don't want it to distract from.
Yeah, I don't want to
because people got 3 hours of.
I'll spend 2 hours on this topic.
But Dr. Bryson, I'm glad that I can say that you're on my team. So, all right, let's.
So you got her. I'll get Richard
about,
Carrier, and then we'll have a 2-on-2. Awesome, sounds good.
Okay, Steve. I doubt that.
Challenge.
Let's talk about Khufu, and he was the great builder of the pyramids, right? Or was that Khafre?
The Great Pyramid at Giza, the biggest one, is the tomb of Khufu.
Okay.
Yep. That statue is like tiny little guy.
It looks pretty small.
So I'm going to let you take it away and tell us about the important things of why he was considered such a great ruler.
Okay, so we have to rewind over 1,000 years from Amenhotep IV to get back to Khufu. Let's go ahead and get our chronology, at least our relative chronology, kind of in our minds, right? So Khufu is the great legendary king of the 4th dynasty. And this is another period when the cult of the sun was a central focus of the ideology of kingship in ancient Egypt. One of Khufu's sons was the first king of Egypt to call himself, we said that the first kings of Egypt called themselves Horus, right? Not Horasce, but it sounds funny. But like the kings called themselves Horus at the beginning of Egyptian history. Well, Khufu's son started to call himself the son of Re, the son of the sun god, right? And that became a standard part of the titulary, the series of names and titles borne by Egyptian kings for the rest of pharaonic history. So Khufu's reign was a period where pharaonic authority was highly centralized, at least sort of in the classical conception of it. This was a time when the king of Egypt could command the entire population and all of the country's economic resources and direct them to a project that sort of served both to enhance his eternal glory, right, his eternal well-being, and thus the eternal well-being of Egypt, right, to sort of help to make him into a powerful god who could forever serve the needs of his people, in the next world, the pyramid, right? And it could also sort of be an economic engine for the country. People would, have to sort of, the idea is at least that the pyramid was built using labor that was sort of mustered the same way you would a militia, that people would be sort of required to come and work for a time on the project as a way of paying taxes. And they've actually recently found papyri that talk about the sort of management of materials for the construction of the pyramid at a spot in coastal Egypt along the Red Sea coast. But Khufu was remembered.
It wasn't slave labor. It wasn't slave labor, like forced.
No.
Okay, then I got to ask this because I really do want to know the answer to this, because I wouldn't even know where to begin to do this, because obviously nowadays we have like QuickBooks and stuff, right? We got computers. Even back in the day, they had accounting. How did they logistically do all this stuff as far as who was owed what and the payments and to get all these? Who kept the books and all this stuff?
An army of scribes, stacks and stacks and stacks of scribes with reams and reams and reams of papyrus.
Papyrus? That's it, really? Just hand on papyrus? Just okay, this person. It really, that must have been just unwieldable, though.
Every action, right? Every sort of government, every sort of state-sponsored transaction in ancient Egypt, from censuses of cattle to the movement of building materials for royal building projects, was supervised by scribes. And they would have sat there, right, with their papyrus. And we have lots of artistic representations of these guys with their little pens and their papyrus, sitting there watching cattle go by or watching stones get moved and watching buildings be built. And sort of making notes, and people coming to them and saying, here are my however many head of cattle, write this down. And then they would send these papyri, right, to superiors at royal residential cities, to sort of government depots, if you will. And there are still extant bodies of correspondence between people sort of out on project sites and royal centers, royal temples actually from the Old Kingdom. There's a group of papyri from Abu Sir that record a lot of transactions like this. So yeah, it was the administrative apparatus of ancient Egypt was incredible.
Had to be.
It wasn't. It wasn't quick books. It would be slow books then, because they had to have time.
It was slow books, yeah.
Like really, right? Yeah.
So,
But you have
Imagine
to,
they had
it,
like a Pentium processor though. That would have been that would have been one. That would have been from the gods, obviously.
I doubt it. That's why it's a virtue. You can doubt things.
Actually, they would have said, where do we plug this thing in at? Where, what powers it? It would just be a brick to them.
the Dendera light bulb. You plug it in the same place you plug in your light bulbs.
There you go.
Well,
they had Baghdad battery, right?
Like over history though, that or is depicted in like drawings and things like that. That it seems to be at one time it was thought they were building these things with slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, has that kind of changed now? Like, do we know something different that says that's not the case? Because you're talking about people are kind of coming to it as a militia.
Well, first off, let's define coerced labor.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The idea that the idea that the pyramids were built by slaves, right, is connected with this narrative that they are somehow with this biblical mythology, right, of the captivity of Israel in Egypt, right, and their service as slaves of the Pharaoh.
Gotcha.
Right? The idea that the pyramids are the granaries of Joseph, or any number of other sort of scenarios that have popped up over the history of Western thought, at least. And the idea that foreigners were brought in chains and whipped into building the pyramids is incorrect. Just flat out.
Awesome.
And there were Egyptian work crews, right? And we actually have marks, like inscriptions, these work crews would leave. There are a series of relieving chambers, they call them, empty spaces above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid at Giza. And that you can still go up there and see where they left, like graffiti, if you will, marks that sort of says, we are the men of the crew, who helped build this pyramid. Right? They were Egyptians.
And how did they learn about this stuff? You said there was training. How did they get training on this stuff? Obviously, the skillcraft involved in some of this stuff. Where did they have schools for these things? Were they just apprenticeships, or how did they massively go about training an army of people to do some of this stuff?
The idea, so there are different levels of skill that would have involved in any project like this, right? Like, it doesn't take a huge amount of skill to pull hard on a rope, but it does take a lot of skill to manage the cutting of a stone. And I think the general conception of how skilled workmen would have been trained is an apprenticeship model, that you would have been set to work with a master over the course of many years.
So non-menial type stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the craziest example of that is that Osiris, I think it's the Osiris tomb, where it's, I don't know how many feet down in the ground that they went, but basically what they did was they built down into the ground and then came down beside of it, building shafts, and would kind of shift the sand over into this shaft. And there was like a 9-foot sarcophagus that they got down there. I forget how much that they said it weighed, but I mean, how in the world do you figure out how to move all of that weight into such a small, like, cramped space? I mean, that's amazing.
We, I think, are not necessarily playing with the same deck of cards conceptually that ancient craftsmen would have had. If you are your whole life, right? Because a lot of crafts and professions were largely hereditary in ancient Egypt, as in a lot of traditional societies. If from very early in your life, you spend most of your time at work, sort of surrounded, right, by the ways that, sort of absorbing the way that you do stuff like that, right? And you are, you're constantly in an environment where large things are being shifted around. You're outside, right, in the natural environment. You might have better proprioception just to begin with. And in a society where there are a lot of grades of literacy, right? Like, skilled workmen might have been partly literate. They might have been able to read well enough to handle receipts and invoices, but not well enough to write a literary story, for instance. or they might have been able to read a certain repertoire of signs, but not a full repertoire of signs. They might have read hieratic and not hieroglyphs. If you're only partly literate, other parts of your brain take over in a lot of cases. You know, like you hear a lot about how people who can't read have amazing memories, right? Have you guys ever sort of, has this concept ever crossed your path?
Yeah,
So wait, so people that could
blind people have like
go
an
ahead.
exceptional hearing. I know that they say that if you're, you know, people who are blind, you can hear things a lot more clear. That sense is kind of heightened. So is that kind of what you're talking about when you
Yeah, you
don't
have more
have
deficiency in one, so
exposure?
you have a little bit more to give to other things, other senses, other abilities.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and other cognitive processes. I know people who are functionally illiterate and they remember things and are able to do calculations in their heads that I can only dream of.
I'm sure that's true. Absolutely. I believe that.
You know, so the kind of skills that an ancient craftsman would have had would probably blow your mind.
Yeah, because they're not
Even
distracted
if they
by things that
wouldn't,
we are.
Sure.
Like
Yeah,
even
nowadays,
if you
exactly. I mean,
couldn't
I see
necessarily
people
map
doing
them onto
artistry.
your skill set.
Oh, you wouldn't want to map them onto my. See, I have no artistry, right? You know, I have people know Kyle does all their artistry. He's a master at artistry. He's very good at doing that kind of stuff. Ask him to do a calculus equation, we might have problems, right? It's just I think people
Right.
have different skill sets, right? I mean, because I can't draw with
no,
the crap. You ask me to draw a stick figure, I won't be able to do it. Literally, I just can't.
I
I can't. My dad was an architect. For a long time, I still can't draw a circle. He was able to make perfect circles and just keep going
Yep.
with them and just over and over, perfect.
My dad's an
Yeah, so
architect and
yeah,
he can do
different
the
skill
same
sets.
thing. And I'm
I
helpless
don't know
with a
how.
pen in my hand. My
It's magic.
handwriting's horrible.
It's magic. No, it literally is
Mhm.
magic. I think it's from the gods. How do you do that? How do you do the same circle just perfectly and just spiral and just keep going? I don't even know how that's done. I have no idea.
My dad says he visualizes it on the piece of paper, that he's able to sort of imagine that there's a circle on that piece of paper and he just traces it.
Even if I
oh
did that, I
that's
couldn't. It's the same thing. I watch tattoo
Me neither.
shows and the people that tattoo.
that's good.
Amazing artistry that they have.
They just freehand it.
They just freehand or they use
And
stencils, but even freehand them. Sorry, go ahead.
the amount of muscle confined motor control that you have to do that is something that takes hours, you know, count, what is it, 10,000 hour rule that you can not an expert or something, it's something until you've done it 10,000 hours. You know, but it does change, if I understand correctly, and I'm hardly a neuroscientist, right? And I don't want to get too far out in left field here, but I understand that there are physical changes in your brain that occur depending on how you use it.
Absolutely,
Sure.
I'm sure that's
I
true.
believe that.
Absolutely. I mean,
Is it
that
really
makes
10,000
complete.
You know, and
That seems like a long
maybe I'm
time.
making
That's
that
what
number up, but
I had
yeah.
3,000 hours of training on nuclear stuff, and I wasn't even close to maybe to being an expert. So I guess 10,000 maybe about right. Yeah.
Don't get.
It's
I'm
a
sure it has to
lot
do
of
with
hours of training.
what you're dealing with, Steve. You're taking things too literally, Steve.
Well, that's what I do. Have you met me?
Unfortunately, I have. Yes. So
Yeah,
we're gonna.
I do exist.
So
Proof
I'm sorry
positive.
to I got you off track there. You were talking about Khufu, and I kind of interjected and got you um, off your point. I hope that I didn't make you forget it. But I jumped in and asked those
Well,
kind of questions from time. My fault.
no, it's fine, actually. I mean, the part of the reason why it's interesting to study an individual pharaoh is because all of these different issues sort of spin off from looking at him as a human being.
Yeah.
Or an individual. Because I mean, I've never met Khufu. I've never shaken the man's hand. There's a limited amount that I can say about him as an individual before I'm really just speculating. I mean, we speculate in any case, but before you're really just making stuff up and
Sure.
being outright irresponsible with the evidence. But putting that image of Khufu up there brings to mind so many fascinating issues in ancient Egyptian engineering, the ancient Egyptian administration, the question of how the ideology of kingship and religion intersected, right? So going off on these
Absolutely.
tangents is actually a productive way to me to engage with this material.
It fascinates
A
me.
lot of
Like
it,
this whole the entire subject. Like I could ask 9 million questions. Just boom, 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 boom. Because I think this is where you really got a kind of idea of a society that came from seemingly nothing and mastered so much in terms of engineering, building, architecture. I mean, their proportions on their statues are near perfect. Their artistry, their creativity, their devotion to their religion. I mean, they kind of, when they decided to do something in a particular field, if you will, they went all in, and it's still surviving to this day. So, I mean, that tells you something.
Well, and when you say, when you talk about the achievement of a society, right, that to me is an interesting problem right there, because if you think about Egypt, in ancient Egyptian society, you're talking about a period here of 3,000 years, right? The pyramids were older for Cleopatra than the birth of Christ is for us.
What?
Right?
Wow.
So
Really?
if you talk about the achievement of Egyptians, well, let's see, the pyramids were built around 2400 BC, and Cleopatra died in 30 BC.
That is wild.
So when you think about it in those terms, the achievement of Egyptian society, we can only just scratch the surface of what we mean by Egyptian society. What's fascinating to me about it is that throughout the entirety of that period, the image of an Egyptian king and what it meant to be an Egyptian king doesn't change all that much. Queen. If you put an image of Cleopatra next to an image of a queen from Khufu's period, right, of an image of Cleopatra in her queenly garb, right, in her queenly form, next to an image of one of Khufu's queens, you can see so many commonalities. If you put an image of, Augustus Caesar as pharaoh next to an image of Amenhotep III as pharaoh, you can see so many commonalities there. And the texts say the same thing, right? This king, serves the gods and improves their welfare. He is the son of Re. He is the lord of the two lands, right? The ideology of kingship, or at least the way that we see it, its expression changed so little over the course of this vast stretch of history that to me is amazingly remarkable, or like amazing and remarkable, I guess is a better way to.
That absolutely is. Because is that, you think, exclusive to Egypt compared to like other countries and their monarchies?
I can't think of any instance of any government institution that has greater longevity than the kingship of Egypt. Help me think here. Think through this with me. If I'm wrong, please tell me.
Would be second? The Chinese dynasty, would that be second?
Well, let's see.
Chinese leaders?
I don't think
the first
so,
Chinese.
I don't know. I don't think so.
Right, the Chinese dynastic cycle begins when? And ends when? If we consider the current communist dynasty of China as a part of that dynastic cycle, then you've got at least 2,200 years going back to the Han Dynasty, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to.
So you're getting close. You're getting close if you think of the current government of China as a part of that cycle, right? And you think of this as an uninterrupted.
So that would be
process
that would be
in
second
China.
That still wouldn't be greater than Egypt. Yeah. Okay.
And really, the ideology, right? The forms in which the current Chinese government presents itself visually are very different from the way that the ancient Chinese rulers represented themselves.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think
and they don't claim the mandate of heaven.
No.
Right. The same way that traditional Chinese.
They don't have that, right. Mandate from heaven, and even the Japanese don't even have their emperors as from divine providence.
Right. I don't think they expressly claim the mandate of heaven.
No, I don't think so.
It was 2100.
Yeah.
When they started, so that Egypt doubled that, essentially.
And yeah, I mean, just and the way that you express it, right? Again, the Chinese dynastic cycle is a tremendously long-lived thing, right? And Chinese historiography is very sophisticated about that. It has been for centuries. But the similarities, the iconographic similarities over the duration of Egyptian history are just so striking. And some of that probably has to do with the materiality of Egyptian monuments and things, right? Like if you're always next door to a temple that shows pictures of the king worshiping the gods, you've always got a good model, a good template, if you will, right?
Absolutely.
So to
That
some
is
extent, right, these kings are.
I was just going to say that is that is a fascinating point. The more that I think about it, because I'm going through like the obvious France, Italy, England, and all of them pretty much kind of had their unique changes between each king. I mean, you can look at castles in England and see the different architecture from would it be Tudor style, Victorian style homes. Like they changed that quickly in that little bit of time. So for you to continue on the same type of look and feel for thousands of years, that's pretty fascinating.
It's phenomenal. And again, like you said, I mean, the European monarchies are chump change historically in a lot of, I mean, not to attach a value, right, to the duration of a government institution. But when you really start thinking about the timescales involved, it becomes pretty amazing to think about the Egyptian monarchy.
Who's your favorite pharaoh to kind of talk about?
That's easy, Horemheb.
Okay, well let's hear about him.
So Horemheb, we just talked about Akhenaten, right?
We did.
So think sort of third quarter of the second millennium BC. Horemheb was apparently a government official under Akhenaten. There was a guy who had a tomb at Amarna whose name was similar to Horemheb's name. We can't be sure it was the same guy, but there are reasons to think it was. And this guy didn't have a royal heritage that we know of. He's never represented as a prince or called the son of a king, right? He might have been a cousin of a king. There's a lot of, his families were pretty big and they had a lot of branches, but he's never called the son of a king. He's not distinguished in any way in terms of his heritage, right? We don't know who his parents were. But as we sort of watch this Amarna episode unfold, there's some kind of conspiracy at court. Akhenaten revolutionizes Egyptian religion and government, moves the capital to Amarna. The city of Akhet-Aten that we were talking about before is the modern site of Amarna in Egypt. So he moves the capital to Amarna. All that gets into gear. It's demolished, right? Akhenaten is anathematized. A couple of brief reigns after Akhenaten sort of represent the last clinks of the dying Amarna period, and then Tutankhamun comes to the throne. He reigns for 10 years. During that time, there are massive efforts to restore the images of the old gods, particularly Amun. And Horemheb weathers the Amarna episode and comes out at the end of it as an official under Tutankhamun, if he is indeed the same guy that was present at Amarna. Horemheb is the top man under Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun starts giving him titles that make it seem like he's the next in line to inherit the throne. He gets a title that essentially translates as crown prince, even though Horemheb doesn't have royal ancestry himself, or at least kingly ancestry, right? So who is this guy, right? How was he so powerful, so effective, that this young king, Tutankhamun, who presumably, right, in the minds of his people at that time, surely had decades in which he could have begotten a male heir, right? He becomes this hugely powerful government figure along with a couple of other people, the god's father Ai and the treasurer Maya. And these men are sort of the inner circle of Tutankhamun and the key players in the restoration of the country after the death of Akhenaten. Tutankhamun dies young, unexpectedly by about these conspiracy theories. And after Tutankhamun dies, childless, Ai, who may have been an in-law, right? He would have been the brother of Tutankhamun's grandmother, perhaps, if we adopt that scenario, becomes king for 4 years. And then at the end of that 4 years, Horemheb, this massively powerful official who apparently got passed over on the death of Tutankhamun for the throne, becomes king of Egypt. His chief title, the title by which he's best known to modern historians, is as Great General of the Army. He was the Generalissimo and Crown Prince Horemheb, a man who came from obscure origins to take the throne of Egypt. And then of his reign itself, we know very, very little. Surprisingly little, less than I think we know.
Interesting. What makes him your favorite?
I like the sort of element of mystery and puzzle solving that goes with him as a character. And I like the fact that his reign is this period of transition, right? You can see in the art that was created at least early in his reign, or for him under Tutankhamun, a lot of this Amarna aesthetic. His patron god was Horus, and specifically, in a lot of circumstances, Re-Herakti, the version of Horus that was associated with Akhenaten. He ruled for either 14 or 28 years, we don't know. And then at the end of it, what we get coming out the other side is Seti I and Ramses II, the beginning of, well, Ramses I, but only for a year. And then Seti I and Ramses II, the great warrior pharaohs of the imperial Egypt of the Ramessid period, right? So where Horemheb fits into that development is an interesting puzzle, an interesting problem. And the way that historians have typically talked about him is to say, oh, he's the guy who solved the Amarna problem once and for all. He's the one who finally kicked Akhenaten to the curb. He's the one, he was devoted to the god Amun and restored him finally, fully to his former glory. And he's the one who founded, who sort of selected his own general and vizier, Paramesu, Ramses I, to succeed him, putting into place a dynasty, because Ramses I would already have had a son and possibly a grandson that he knew were promising men of ability, puts this powerful military family in charge of Egypt and sets the stage for this the imperial glory of the early Ramessid era.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of the conventional narrative.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
If you look more closely at the monuments of his reign, which is what I was doing for my dissertation, you start to notice that almost everything with Horemheb's name on it was made for somebody else originally. That he finished other people's projects. He started projects of his own. But even if he reigned 14 years, there are surprisingly few things that were started, worked on, and finished under Horemheb. There are surprisingly few people who seem to want to put on the walls of their tomb, hey, look at me, I worked for this guy.
Yeah, okay.
At least at Thebes.
That makes sense. It seems to be like that would be a thing all across Egypt as a whole, though, because the projects are so unbelievably massive and detailed that I don't know what was the average age that like a pharaoh would live back then.
You know, you could calculate it on the basis of the reign lengths that we know of, but a lot of them, so Ramses II lived to be quite old even by modern standards, but most of them probably died between their 30s and their 50s.
That's what I
40 would be considered to be old, right?
Yeah.
40 would, for an upper class Egyptian, so the problem with mortality is that if you live to a certain age, you're more likely to keep on living. So in a lot of ancient societies, you'll have some very old individuals, and those will usually be people who were healthy to begin with and who also had the benefit of an easier life. So it's not uncommon, actually. It's surprisingly common to find among the upper echelons of Egyptian society people who live to be fairly old. Looking at an average age at death is not a great representation necessarily of what you should expect in a given individual. But overall, 40 would have been a pretty advanced and respectable age.
I just don't see how you can get, because let's say that they take the throne in their 20s or 30s. If you only have 15 years left on average to enjoy, to do these projects, I don't see how you can fit those level of like architecture and engineering in that 15 years, just with the stuff that they had to use. It seems like it would take 5 years just to quarry the stones, probably.
Just to do the blueprints.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the reigns And the kings from whose reigns we have the biggest number of monuments and the biggest, most impressive monuments are the ones who rule the longest, who came to the throne as children or who lived to an advanced age.
Yeah.
So, like Amenhotep III ruled for close to 40 years, and he built incredible numbers of enormous statues. Like the corpus of stone statuary from his reign is unbelievable. But they had 40 years to do it. And from shorter reigns, you typically find fewer statues.
That makes sense.
Fewer buildings built, that sort of thing.
Well, that makes sense.
I'm always, I love these conversations, but the one thing that frustrates me is that it seems these go by so quick. Like we've almost hit the 2 hour mark, and that to me just seems like it's crazy, because when we do other streams, you can feel the length of time as it gets to the 2 hour marks. These go by so quickly that it's crazy.
Well, I enjoy talking to you guys. You're clearly smart, thoughtful people, and it's really fun to talk to you about these issues. I enjoy it, and I appreciate your time.
Boy, we can fake a lot of things, can't we?
Yeah, we just pretend on YouTube.
My computer
you don't actually have to be smart. You just have to appear smart. That's the.
My computer, though, is keenly aware of the passage of time. I'm about to run out of batteries.
Okay, well, works out good. We're going to obviously have you back if you will come back to talk with us. I would like to continue this to go through some more of the Pharaohs. We got to one of the ones on this list, and that's always my fault because I go off on so many different tangents. But thank you for being a good sport and going down those crazy narrow ways with me. I just have a curious mind, and these kind of subjects I think are important to have, even though it happened so long ago. They still have a very useful application, I think, in today's life. You can learn so much by what they did and the kind of lessons that they taught, I think. And plus, it's interesting. So having you come on is fantastic.
Well, thank you so much.
Between
I really
the Egyptology
appreciate
and Syriology, it's awesome. And I definitely find it. I again, not something I know that much about, but that's why I like these types of conversations, because I get to dive into things that I normally would not be reading up on. So this is actually things that I love learning about. I just thrill when I have somebody come in and talk about these kind of things.
Well, it's been great, guys. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And actually, we'll be having Dr. Bryson join us on the panel to talk about Bernard Limborell's book at some point once we get everybody on that same page. So she'll be back for that and some more Egyptology soon, hopefully. But thank you again for coming on. Absolutely. And guys, we'll see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock for Should You Spank Your Kids? That'll be interesting.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Right.